I think my one question, earlier I spoke about this need for measurement, and there's lots of different ways to measure and different qualities that I think will help us advance tall buildings and urban habitats if we start to give ourselves benchmarks. So I think my first question I'd like to ask Assistant Secretary General Michael Adlerstein, that to ask you, you mentioned in your talk about the many measurements you did during the design process to try to achieve green building performance standards, and there seemed to be much work surrounding that area. And I'm curious if you could speak to maybe the reason why you decided, and your group decided, not to pursue any of the common measurement standards of buildings such as LEED and BREEAM and so on, or why did you decide not to go forward with getting the certifications?
We did understand the importance of, in terms of understanding the benefits of the project, so it was important to provide the member states with a metric so they could evaluate how we did. But the UN is, I mentioned this, but the UN is sovereign. It's not within any jurisdiction. So we did have our consultants evaluate whether we met these standards, but we couldn't, we don't apply because we're not in the United States, we're not in New York City, we're in a sovereign territory. So we're not allowed to actually apply to any entity and pay a fee to any entity for measurements or for certification or for registration. However, we did the equivalent of it by evaluating ourselves through consultants, which are available for any project, through consultants to give us whether we achieved our metric. So, but we do fully support these metrics as being very important so that a project can be evaluated on, it's not just trust me, it's a question of meeting certain criteria.
Hello, Rafael Oliveira here, consultant with Thornton Tomasetti and city representative of CTBUH in São Paulo, Brazil. The question is for Peter. First of all, congratulations on the award, very well deserved award. Yesterday, Rafael Vignoli gave a talk here at IIT, and he mentioned for the building with the windbreaks, that it was his idea. Was it actually his idea? And more importantly, do you expect seeing that kind of system on these ever more slender buildings? And also, how do wind tunnel tests compare with computer simulations? Do you expect that computer simulations are going to get to a point where you don't need wind tunnel tests anymore? What is the advantage of doing the wind tunnel tests? Thank you.
Okay, well, first to the question on whose idea it was to have these openings in the building. I'm assuming that's what the question is. I think it was through discussion. I mean, we're aerodynamic experts, but we're not architects at RWDI. So we throw out a number of ideas which is food for thought, and then the architect thinks, how can I integrate that into my design? So I like to treat it as a kind of collaboration rather than anyone's particular idea. And but that is one option. In that particular case, the owner was very specific that they did not want to adjust the corners of the building, and we respected that. And then so you go with other options for reducing the wind response. As to your second question was on use of computing methods to calculate the wind forces. Computational fluid dynamics has been advancing over the years. Back in the 1960s, it started to be used for design of aircraft. But the flows over streamlined shapes like that are very different from over buildings. And throughout my career, I've heard people say, oh, within another 10 years, CFD will be the thing. And 10 years goes by, and it's still another 10 years because we don't have the kind of confidence yet that it can do what the wind tunnel does. However, I am convinced that ultimately, with the power of computers, as we get, supercomputing powers are getting more and more common, ultimately it may well be able to take over from the wind tunnel, but we're not there yet. It's at least another 10 years away.
I have a question for the Ole and the last project, it seems that presumably these are all market condos or not. For example, is there in the programming, are there any variations in terms of accommodations for lower end? No, these seem very expensive apartments, or maybe I'm wrong. So in terms of, my question is, what kind of considerations on a wider spectrum of buyers did you take or make?
Well, in a way, I'm very happy you asked that question, because I think what's an important aspect of the project is that this is not a project that ranges at the upper scale of sales prices and value in the market. On the contrary, it's on a mid-level, so basically a young family with 2 children teaching at university can afford to buy there. And it's also a project that is, I think, I don't know what the exact number is at this point, but I think at some point close to 90% occupied. People actually live there. And for me, that's a very important aspect, because I think architecture and buildings, residential developments are more and more, if you like, victim to a speculative mechanisms where things are bought no longer to live, but just to resell 2 or 3 years later, which in a way kills any ambition of reality and of social or communal reality. And what you could see with the few images shown as sort of whatever casual they may be, but I think the beauty of the project is that first of all, people can really afford to live there, and people do live there. And that, for me, is really the major success. So it was also built at a price point that allows for this.
But my question was for Juan, because he hasn't answered a question yet. And I just wanted to ask, with the energy savings, you said that was a 50% energy saving, yeah, which is incredible. But is 75% of that energy cost saving? So we're talking an economic thing here because of the 4 credits for every 1 that you're getting back?
Yeah, maybe that was just a misunderstanding. I said we're required to produce 5% on on-site generation, which we do. But by selling it back at a 5-to-1 rate, you can see that automatically becomes 25%. 20%, 25%, that grows by the RECs. And the way so you take that REC and you make it a 25%, right? And you said, okay, that's for an overall building consumption. But if you start saying, can I power just the basic building life systems with this, that automatically jumps to a much higher rate, to 50, 60% of the building basic systems are powered by that, due through the payback that you get from the energy companies. So if it's just directly, if you're just building it and putting it and using your own energy, you can be at 5%. What makes it possible is that you can actually get that REC from the government, and that incentives is what's actually allowing this to happen there, which we don't see in a lot of cities, and that's one of the problems we're having with this technology, having a very return pay period, 30 years, but adding that buy-in from the government, helping that technology actually exist in these places is making it doable.
From the first look at the layout of the interlace, it's extremely complex. And then you immediately think about wayfinding problem. So the compliment is that you really did a great job in using public art to help people in the wayfinding. But from emergency response, I'm not sure what you did.
Well, first of all, orientation is by public art, but really primarily at first by landscape, because each one of these courtyards has a very different landscape environment. And indeed, you don't go home to a specific building at first, but you go to your courtyard and from there into your building. If you talk about emergency, I mentioned the fire truck route. Obviously, that basically makes a big loop around the project in an extremely logical and straightforward way. And provides, therefore, also a very simple response mechanism.
With respect to the interlace, Ole, I really like what you've done there, because it's sort of looking ahead as we think about the densification of cities and more people moving into cities. This provides a way to give people a sense of space within an ever-tightening urban core. One of the things I see in it is a lot of opportunity for natural ventilation, daylighting, and things like that. Can you just comment about whether or not people who are living there now are naturally ventilating, what their experience is in terms of outdoors versus shutting their spaces up in air conditioning? Because I know what the climate's like in Singapore. Just wonder if you can play on that a little bit for us, please.
Right. Well, Again, the kind of permeability of the entire development was really one of the key ideas from the very beginning. And indeed, looking at winds, which I think it's one of the few things we didn't do together with you, although many other projects we did, was key, and really creating these microclimates. And I think maybe Tiang can report a bit on that. But as you move through the courtyards, it's sort of as if by magic there's always a light breeze, and it's actually always a little bit cooler there than it is elsewhere. That, together with the naturally ventilated cores of the buildings and all the access systems, and apartments that typically face minimum of 2 directions of the facade, sometimes 3, so have a through ventilation through the block, actually allow for a very high degree of that. But maybe I'll...
Yes. And a question about like if people live with their windows open. Yes, the majority of them actually have their windows open. In Singapore, actually, most people actually enjoy actually the open concept of living. They only turn on the aircon when, like, usually in the evenings when it gets really warm. But I would say like 75% of the time, it's actually all naturally ventilated, and also thanks to the good cross ventilation. The other thing is that I've been to the site a lot of times, and always find that the shade of the building itself is a true fact that you can actually walk on a hot day in the shade. I can still remember the first time when we were designing this project. Ola sent one of his colleagues over, and we actually brought him through general walks in Singapore, and it gets really, really hot in the daytime. So that was why I think a lot of emphasis on this study of how the sun shading of the blocks, and where we plant our trees, and where we allow the main thoroughfare through the development itself. And that has actually culminated in this project at the end, where we have certain spots where you can see very green corners, and then we actually placed the water bodies at the north part where we actually foresee the monsoon winds coming in. So that's where you got all these little wind elements in the development.